Have you ever thought about how long ancient philosophy stuck around and how it kind of just keeps going through time? Well, today we're going deeper than just hearing the echoes. We're diving right into a time period when that legacy was being debated, saved, and it completely changed. And that's Byzantine philosophy. It's kind of like special journey, for those who love philosophy.
Exactly. As you join us, think of this not as some boring history class, but as a conversation with philosophers who are asking the same big questions that we still think about today. We'll be shining a light on their unique ideas and contributions in a way that connects with your own love of philosophy.
That's a great way to put it. Welcome to our deep dive into Byzantine philosophy, which was around from about 730 to 1453 AD. We're using this super detailed overview from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to guide us. Our goal, and I think you'll appreciate this as a big-time philosophy fan, is to uncover the main things about Byzantine philosophy and all the cool debates they had. We're going to show how it's connected to the ancient world, but also how it did its own thing. Get ready for some surprises, like those aha moments when you learn something new and interesting as we explore this together.
And I think one of the most amazing things for any philosopher checking out Byzantine thought is that it just flows right from ancient Greek culture. Unlike what happened in the Arab world or the Latin West, where they had to rediscover things, the Byzantines always had it. Just think about it. Homer's Iliad wasn't some lost book they found. It was a regular textbook in their schools throughout that whole Byzantine period. So that makes you wonder, right? How did this constant connection to those ancient texts affect their ideas about ethics, politics, and art compared to those who found them much later?
Whoa, that's a really interesting point. Imagine how familiar they were with those ideas and all the different interpretations built up over centuries of just reading them. It wasn't like a sudden, oh, wow, lost knowledge thing for them. It was more like an ongoing conversation with these foundational texts. But it wasn't always smooth sailing, right?
Definitely not. There were times when things went downhill culturally and they weren't so into those ancient ideas. Sometimes they even lost some texts or traditions, but then we see these awesome revivals, like bursts of energy where they started studying the ancient stuff again with a passion.
And those revivals are so important to understanding the whole story of Byzantine philosophy. We're talking about times like the late Phrygian to early Macedonian period, from 842 to 959. Back then, they were super focused on carefully copying those ancient texts in this special tiny script called minuscule. What does that tell us about how important preserving and sharing knowledge was to them?
It shows how dedicated they were to keeping that intellectual legacy alive. Then, after that, we have another big moment for philosophy in the late Macedonian to early Comnenian period, from 1042 to 1143. And last but not least, there's the early Paleologan era, from 1259 to 1341. It's cool how these times often line up with when they were setting up or really beefing up imperial schools of philosophy in Constantinople. So what do you think? When the government is directly involved in encouraging philosophy, what does that say about how important it was to Byzantine society?
It definitely shows they supported it in a way that we don't always see. It wasn't just about the government-run schools, though. Private tutors were a big deal, too. Names like Nikephoros Plamides, Gregory of Cyprus, Nikephoros Gregoras, and later George Gemistos Pluthon were super important in that area. And we can't forget about the patriarchal school, especially during the Comnenian and Paleologan periods, which was all about educating the clergy. So how do you think these different ways of learning, imperial schools, private tutors, and the patriarchal school, affected the kind of philosophy they were doing?
That's a really good question. Education in Byzantium wasn't like the independent universities in the Latin West. Their goal was to train people to work for the state and the church. They were more focused on practical stuff than just pure scholarship. That probably had a big impact on the types of philosophical questions they thought about and the methods they used. Do you think this might explain why they loved encyclopedic knowledge and rhetoric more than super specialized or systematic theological studies?
That's a fascinating connection. If they were trying to create well-rounded government folks and clergy who could communicate really well, then having a broad understanding and being skilled in rhetoric would be super important. It makes sense that logic, even though it's part of their studies, didn't become the main tool for systematic theology like it did in the West. So it seems like the core of their philosophy education was built on this pretty solid foundation with Aristotelian logic at the center, right?
Right. They typically studied Porphyry's isagogy, Aristotle's categories, De Interpretatione, and the first parts of prior analytics and Sophistici Elenchi. Those were like their logic toolkit.
And then they went on to natural philosophy, with selections from Aristotle's physics, De Generatione et Corruptione, and meteorology. They also learned math from Nicomachus's Introductio Arithmetica and the first 6 books of Euclid's Elements. That shows a deep connection to the classic trivium and quadrivium.
It sure does. And we should mention that they often learned these fundamental ideas through compendia, which are like condensed versions. Think about Nicephorus Blamides' Epitome Logica and Epitome Physica, or the Anonymous Logic and Quadrivium. Even John of Damascus's Dialectica was similar. What do you think about their use of these condensed versions? Does it make you wonder how deeply they were engaging with the original texts, especially in the earlier times?
It does make you think, right? Were they always catching all the details and the subtle arguments? Or were they mainly focused on getting a general idea for practical use? It's interesting that before the 12th century, when Byzantines wrote commentaries on Aristotle, they almost always focused on his logic stuff. That really shows what their educational priorities were at the time. In those earlier centuries, natural philosophy was mostly learned from more basic compendia, like the ones by Simeon Seth.
Here's something that makes things even more complex. Scholars are taking another look at a physics commentary. For a long time, they thought it was by Michael Psellos, a really important figure we'll talk about later. But now they think it was more likely written by George Pachymeres in the late 13th century. This kind of shows how tricky it can be to put together the history of Byzantine thought and how important it is to keep analyzing our sources.
It seems like they made a real effort to broaden their study of Aristotle after 1118, when Anaxagoras started asking for commentaries on his works that they hadn't paid as much attention to before. What do you think made them interested in expanding their Aristotelian studies at that specific time?
Well, from what we can tell, it seems like Anaxagoras is just personally curious about it. Not that it was the start of some huge trend in Aristotelian scholarship. It shows that there was some interest in a wider range of philosophical questions, even if it didn't immediately change the main ways they did education.
And they weren't just talking philosophy in schools, right? We hear about things like Photios' literary salons back in the 9th century and the theatra during the early Paleogen period, where they'd present and debate essays. It sounds like those were important, less formal places to exchange ideas. How do you think those different settings, the classroom versus the salon, affected how they talked about philosophy?
Yeah, I bet in those less formal places, they were more focused on a wider range of ideas and different perspectives. It was probably more open-ended compared to the more structured classroom setting.
Okay, so now that we have an idea of how they learned, let's talk about how Byzantine philosophers expressed their ideas. Their focus on rhetoric in their education seems to have had a big impact on the ways they wrote about philosophy.
Absolutely. Because rhetoric was so central to their education, they ended up using a really wide variety of forms in their philosophical writings. Some forms were clearly meant for teaching or scholarly stuff, while others seem to have been more for expressing complex ideas or even for artistic reasons.
Let's start with the philosophical dialogue, a form that goes way back to the ancient world and continued in Byzantium, although maybe not as much as in the West. It's interesting that they seem to categorize these dialogues as either Plato pastiches or Lucian pastiches. What do you think these different stylistic choices tell us about what the author was trying to do, or the type of philosophical questions they were exploring?
I think choosing a particular style showed which philosophical tradition the author liked or the tone they wanted to set. Plato pastiches might have been for seriously exploring ideas, while Lucian pastiches could use satire and humor to critique people or philosophical positions at the time, like in the early 12th century Temerian, where they make fun of philosophers like Michael Psellos and John Idalos.
And the Socratic eclectic dialogue, that question and answer style meant to find contradictions, seems to have been popular for arguments, even though a lot of the debates were about theological differences rather than pure philosophy. Were there times when they used this form for strictly philosophical reasons?
Yeah, while a lot of those eclectic dialogues did drift into theological topics, there were definitely some exceptions. Theodore Prodromos's Xenodemus, or Predicables, is a more playful but still insightful look at logical categories. And Nicephorus Gregoris's Florentius, or On Wisdom, gets into a more critical philosophical debate. Then there's this super interesting anonymous work called Hermippus, or On Astrology. It's really from the 14th century, and it uses dialogue to explore the relationship between astrology and Christian ideas about providence and free will, which shows how they were trying to combine different ways of thinking.
Moving on, we see philosophical treatises, which are like prose monologues where authors presented their personal thoughts on specific topics. It looks like these were especially common during those 3 periods when philosophical activity really peaked. What made the Byzantine philosophical treatise unique?
These treatises were a direct way for Byzantine thinkers to share their own ideas. They often talked about classical sources, but also offered new interpretations or arguments. You could say examples of this in Nikephoros Chymnos' Logoi, but honestly, his writing style could be a bit tough to follow sometimes.
Theodore Medakaitis' Samiches Nunakai seems really important. It says that he was like a precursor to Montaigne in that he was aiming for a self-portrait as a philosopher and even theorizing about how philosophical writing should be done. That sounds like a very self-aware and almost proto-existential approach to philosophy. What makes his work stand out in this way?
What's cool about Metakites is how introspective his work is and how much it focuses on the philosopher's own experiences and thoughts. He wasn't just trying to present abstract arguments, he wanted his writing to show what it meant to live a philosophical life, which is something we see Montaigne doing later on. And it wasn't all prose either. Byzantine thinkers used orations and even hexameter poetry to explore philosophical ideas, just like Metochites did. John Setzes paraphrased Porphyry's Isagog in dodecasyllabic verse, which is another example of how they combined philosophy with creative writing.
And they wrote tons of letters in Byzantium, which they also used for philosophical discussions. People like Michael Psellos and Theodore Prodromos would talk about philosophy in their letters. What do you think were the benefits of using this more informal way of communicating for philosophical exploration?
I think writing letters let them share ideas more directly and personally. It was probably a more relaxed and open way to think about philosophical questions, less bound by the rules of formal treatises or commentaries.
And then there are more educational and scholarly forms, like collections of questions and answers. John Idalus's Quadrasines Quadrupels is a great example. These collections give us a peek into the kind of philosophical questions they were asking in their academic settings.
That's right. These collections probably came from classroom discussions or were used as exercises for students. They show us the specific philosophical problems they were thinking about and how they were expected to argue.
Compendia were super popular too. Some focused on certain areas like logic or the quadrivium, like the ones by John Cordesmenos and George Pacamir's. Then there were bigger, more general compendia, like Pacamir's Philosophia and Joseph Rakendite's Encyclopedia, which even covered things like rhetoric and medicine. What do you think the popularity of these compendia tells us about the main goals of philosophy in Byzantium?
I think it shows that Byzantine philosophy was really focused on education, especially introducing students to key philosophical subjects, especially logic. They were essential tools for navigating the world of classical thought.
Now, let's talk about something super important in Byzantine philosophy commentaries on ancient thinkers, and it was mostly Aristotle. It's interesting that there weren't many commentaries on Plato after 730 AD, except for George Pacamir's work on the Parmenides. Why do you think they focus so much on Aristotle?
It's probably because they used Aristotle so much in their curriculum, especially in logic and natural philosophy. His work was the basis for their philosophy education. The commentaries themselves came in different forms. Some were simple notes in the margins called scholia, like Aretha's notes on the Isagoge, which actually included stuff from earlier commentaries that are now lost.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty neat. And then there were more structured commentaries.
Right, we see scholia with introductions that often followed the ways of those earlier Alexandrian commentators, like in Leo Magentinos' work.
And then there's the running commentary, where the commentator's analysis is woven right into the text, often using lemata, which are quotes from the original text. Michael of Ephesus and Eustratios of Nicaea were big names in developing this more integrated style of commentary.
So, the Alexandrian model even influenced how they organized their commentaries, dividing them into praxis, Veturia, and Lexis. Though, to be fair, it's hard to find perfect examples from later Byzantium. But you can see this influence in Eustratios' commentary on the second book of Posterior Analytics.
And in the late Byzantine period, we see these even more complex commentary structures, especially with George Scholarios. His commentaries were divided into lessons or anagises. That was influenced by Latin scholasticism. They included introductions, detailed analyses, and investigations or zootomata. That points to some cross-cultural exchange of ideas in the later centuries.
Last but not least, let's talk about paraphrases. These are basically reworded and adapted versions of Aristotle's texts that were meant to make them easier to understand. The Mysians started doing this back in the 4th century, and it was revived in Byzantium by Michael Psellos and later Sophonius. What do you think motivated them to create these paraphrases?
I think they were mostly for teaching, to give students a simpler way to understand Aristotle's complex ideas. It's interesting that the paraphrases of Aristotle we know the dates for mostly fall within those three periods we talked about when philosophical activity was at its peak. We also see some combined forms, like Sophonius mixing paraphrase with commentary, and Pachomir's structuring his Philosophia more like a topical compendium than a traditional commentary.
They didn't just paraphrase Aristotle, though. We see Christianized versions of Proclus by Isaac Sebastocrator and of Epictetus by some anonymous authors. There's also a paraphrase of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos that might be by Proclus.
Yeah.
They seem to have been trying to integrate and reinterpret a lot of classical thought through a Byzantine lens.
Exactly. It shows how actively they were engaging with their classical heritage. They were preserving it, but also adapting and reinterpreting it to fit their own intellectual and cultural context.
All right, so now we've got a good handle on how they learned and the different ways they wrote about philosophy. Let's highlight some of the big names and intellectual trends in Byzantine philosophy. We'll keep it concise and focus on what's interesting for a philosophy enthusiast like you.
Okay, starting in the 9th century, there's Photios. He's a huge figure, not just for reviving the study of ancient works, which you can see in his massive bibliothèque and lexicon, but also for his critical thinking about basic philosophical ideas in his essays on the categories. In those essays, he critiques both Plato's theory of forms and Aristotle's concept of substance.
And then there's Arethusa, who was super important in preserving those ancient texts, especially Plato. His work on the Clarkianus 39 manuscript is a great example. He made sure those works were around for future generations of Byzantine thinkers.
Around the 11th and 12th centuries, there's a big shift. Philosophers were no longer just passing on existing knowledge. They started thinking more independently, forming their own views, and applying philosophy to questions about theology and even everyday life.
Michael Psellos is a perfect example of this change. He called himself the consul of the philosophers. And he not only wrote commentaries and paraphrases of Aristotle's Organon, but also wrote treatises on all sorts of philosophical topics. He even wrote his own encyclopedia called De Omnifaria Doctrina. He really liked Plato and the Neoplatonists. He even tried to adapt Proclus's metaphysics to fit into Christianity. But all that love for Neoplatonic ideas got him in trouble with the religious folks. What do you think is the philosophical significance of this tension between classical thought and Christian doctrine in Psellos's work?
I think Psellos shows how tough it was to make classical reason work with Christian revelation, which was a recurring theme in Byzantine intellectual history. He wanted to combine Neoplatonism and Christianity, which shows he was trying to find a philosophical basis for theological beliefs. But it also shows how risky that can be when you might end up challenging established dogma.
His student, John Idalos, was similar, but faced even more resistance. He got in trouble for saying they should use philosophical analysis in theology, and even suggesting that theology was a branch of philosophy. The Synodicon still talks about his condemnation today. It shows the limits of what you could question philosophically within that Byzantine religious context. What kind of deeper philosophical questions do you think come up when you challenge the idea that theology is more important than philosophy, like Idalos did?
Idalos's ideas bring up those big questions about how reason and faith relate and how much freedom philosophical inquiry really has. The fact that he was condemned shows that many in Byzantium believed that theological truth trumps philosophical reasoning, which could limit independent philosophical investigation, especially when it came to religious doctrines.
In the early 12th century, Eudratios of Nicaea and Michael of Ephesus were key players. They contributed a lot to the tradition of writing commentaries on Aristotle's less popular works, which was encouraged by Anaximander. And their commentaries actually influenced Western Aristotelianism later on. But even Eustratios was accused of heresy, partly because he used Aristotelian syllogisms in theological arguments. Again, it's a delicate balance.
For sure. Eustratios shows how people could get suspicious when you used philosophical tools, especially Aristotelian logic, for theology. Even though he tried to make his Neoplatonic understanding of Aristotle fit with Christian beliefs about the soul's creation, using logical arguments in theology could be seen as stepping on the toes of religious authority. Michael of Ephesus, though, is known for being super knowledgeable about Aristotle as a commentator, almost like Alexander of Aphrodisias. That suggests he was really immersed in Aristotle's thought.
Then there's Nicholas of Methone, who stands out because he directly refuted Proclus's elements of theology. He wanted to counter Neoplatonic influence on Christian dogma. Specifically, he argued against the idea of pure unity as the fundamental principle of the universe. That's a much more direct and critical response to a particular Neoplatonic text.
Yeah, it is. Nicholas's critique shows that people were becoming more aware of and resistant to some Neoplatonic ideas that they saw as conflicting with Christian doctrine.
As we move into the later periods, there's Nikephoros Blemades. He was a great teacher and scholar, known for his influential compendia on logic and natural philosophy. He also stressed how useful logic was for arguing about theology, and even defended orthodox dogma against papal legates. That shows how intertwined philosophy and theology were.
And then there's George Pachymeres. He was incredibly productive and wrote a ton, including a huge Aristotelian paraphrase compendium called Philosophia, a textbook on the quadrivium, and commentaries on a bunch of Aristotle's works. He even wrote a unique commentary on Plato's Parmenides from a late Byzantine perspective, which was more logical and paraphrastic in its approach. He was also really involved in collecting manuscripts, which shows how committed the Byzantines were to preserving their intellectual heritage.
It's interesting that Plato started becoming more popular in response to Western thought during this later period. We also see thinkers like Nikephoros Chumnos writing essays about natural philosophy, trying to find philosophical support for theological ideas, and even critiquing both Aristotle's theory of the heavens and Plato's theory of forms. He interpreted forms as pre-existing matter and separate entities. That shows a more independent and critical view of those classical authorities.
His rival, Theodore Metachites, was all about being original in his Semichas's Nomikai. He explored all kinds of topics and reflected on themes like transience. He also paraphrased Aristotle's natural philosophy and wrote this huge introduction to Ptolemaic astronomy, where he argued that math was better than natural philosophy. He really understood the connection between different intellectual disciplines.
Metachites' student, Nikephoros Gregoras, started out as an astronomer, but then got involved in theological debates. His dialogue, Florentius, critiques Aristotle, and he also argued with Barlaam of Calabria. Barlaam initially loved Greek philosophy and mathematics, but later got involved in the hesychast strife.
And speaking of the Hesychast controversy, Gregory Palamas came out on top. He emphasized the difference between God's essence and energies, saying that what we observe about the world is just as important as theological truths. That led him to criticize Greek natural philosophers. That's a big shift in the relationship between philosophy and theology, clearly prioritizing theological experience.
In the late Byzantine Empire, philosophers started picking sides, becoming either Platonists or Aristotelians. This was different from earlier times when they tried to harmonize the two. It shows how much they disagreed on some fundamental things.
Yeah, and this all culminates with George Gemistus Platon. He published De Differentiis, arguing that Plato was way better than Aristotle. He pretty much criticized everything about Aristotle's philosophy. And he went even further, advocating a type of Neoplatonic polytheism and rejecting Christianity altogether, which was a radical move in Byzantine society.
Then we have George, Gennadios Scholarios, who responded with Contraplethonym. He defended Aristotle and emphasized the idea of God as creator through an eternal act of creation. His commentaries on Porphyry and Aristotle's logic were heavily influenced by Latin scholasticism, especially Thomas Aquinas, whose works he translated. He even ordered them to destroy Platon's controversial Book of Laws. Scholarios also debated Platon about fate and free will, arguing that freedom meant submitting to Zeus's decree. These final intellectual battles really highlight how dynamic and sometimes heated their engagement with classical philosophy was, even as Byzantium was coming to an end.
It's amazing how much they were thinking, interpreting, and reacting to all that ancient Greek philosophy. And they were always thinking about it in relation to theology and the changing world around them.
For our last segment, let's dive into two specific philosophical topics that were really important to Byzantine thinkers: the immortality of the soul and the metaphysics of universals. Looking at these debates will give us a better understanding of what they were really concerned about philosophically.
The question of whether the soul lives on after death was a big one, as you can imagine. It's where Orthodox Christian doctrine and the Aristotelian ideas that influenced Byzantine natural philosophy could potentially clash. Aristotle defined the soul and the anima as the form of the body, which makes you wonder if it can exist apart from the body and keep going after the body dies. How did Byzantine thinkers deal with this tricky question?
It's true. While Aristotle seemed to say that the soul can't be separated from the body, his concept of nous, or intellect, left room for discussion about immortality. He described the productive and active intellect as the only part that's immortal and eternal. But that doesn't tell us what happens to the individual soul.
Right, and that ambiguity led to a lot of debate. Theodore Metochites even talked about all the different ways commentators interpreted Aristotle's view on immortality. Some, like Alexander of Aphrodisias, thought Aristotle believed the soul was mortal, which is something even some early Christian writers like Hippolytus and Gregory of Nyssa used to criticize him.
But, like Metochites pointed out, some people thought the opposite. They said Aristotle did believe that part of the soul was immortal. They pointed to the times he talked about how the intellect can work independently and how it's like the pilot of a ship.
Yeah.
What did this analogy have to do with their arguments for immortality?
They used the pilot analogy to say that, just like a pilot steering a ship, the intellect could exist and function on its own, separate from the body. That implied it could continue to exist even after the body died. This interpretation became a key part of the standard Neoplatonic view, and commentators like John Philoponus developed these complex systems where they distinguish between different parts of the soul. They said only the rational soul, or the intellect, could be completely separate and immortal.
It's interesting how those Neoplatonic commentators just assumed that what Aristotle called the productive intellect was actually part of each person's soul. That seems like a crucial step in trying to make Aristotle's ideas fit with the idea of personal immortality.
Definitely. Thinkers like John Idalos and Sophonius continued to argue that only the rational soul was truly immortal, even against those who suggested that existence after death might be more universal or less personal. Nicephorus Blemmydes also used that pilot analogy to illustrate how the rational soul could exist independently and how it experiences tension when it's tied to the body. And Michael of Ephesus argued that Aristotle believed in the soul's immortality because the intellect could potentially be fully realized after being separated from the body.
Metachites himself came up with this fascinating but maybe controversial argument. He used Aristotle's argument against self-movement in the physics and tried to connect it to the idea that anything that's self-moving must be immortal. He got some inspiration from Plato's Phaedrus. Can you explain how that argument works?
So Metachites is basically saying that if something can move itself, it wouldn't just stop existing because its very nature is to start its own movement. According to this line of thinking, the soul can move itself, so it has to be immortal. But, like the text mentions, there might be a flaw in this logic. Aristotle was talking about movement as a relative concept, and that might not directly translate to an argument about something being inherently indestructible.
But it's important to understand this in the context of Neoplatonism, where they often used ontological arguments to prove immortality. They interpreted Aristotle's discussion of movement in a way that allowed for the soul's self-activity as evidence of its enduring nature.
Exactly. Neoplatonic thinkers often distinguish between physical movement and a more abstract kind of self-movement that they attributed to the soul or intellect. For instance, Proclus even tried to use Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover to prove the existence of a self-moved soul. So even though people might debate the specifics of Metachites' argument, it reflects a broader intellectual tradition trying to understand the nature and ultimate fate of the soul.
Let's switch gears to metaphysics. The problem of universals, the question of what general terms actually refer to, was another big area of focus for Byzantine philosophers. How did they approach this age-old philosophical puzzle?
Byzantine thinkers, including guys like Idalos, Eustratios, Blemmydes, Chomnos, and Scholarios, mostly followed how the Neoplatonists tried to combine Plato and Aristotle's ideas about universals. They generally used Ammonius's influential framework, which outlines 3 ways to understand genera or broad categories.
Those 3 ways are, first, the genera before the particulars, proton Paul, which in a Christian context is often understood as Plato's forms existing in the mind of God.
Second, the genera in the particulars, en pois poloi, which corresponds to Aristotle's immanent forms, the forms that exist within individual things.
And third, the genera after the particulars, epi toi poloi or meta tus polm, which are the concepts that we form in our minds by abstracting from specific instances.
This 3-part framework became the standard way to discuss universals in the Byzantine era. You see it in the works of many thinkers.
The text mentions that this approach has been called conceptual, moderate realist, and even nominalist or conceptualist. That tells me there's a lot of nuance and maybe even some ambiguity in how they understood these categories.
Absolutely. John Idalos' detailed analysis of universals in his Questiones Quodlibetales provides a lot of insight into this complexity. He differentiates the genera before the particulars, linking them to Christian theological doctrines from the genera in and after the particulars, which he says are later born, predicable, can't be separated from the particulars, and are required through abstraction.
So Idalos seems to think that the genera and the particulars are inherently connected to the specific individuals they describe. Like the animal in Socrates isn't exactly the same as the animal in Plato, whereas the genera after the particulars are the general concepts we can apply to lots of different individuals.
Right, and this interpretation brings up the question of whether Idalos thought Aristotle's immanent forms were individualized rather than truly universal, which could align with the views of Proclus and Syrianus. Regardless, he saw both the in rebus and post-res genera as coming from the mind's process of abstraction.
But the crucial point is that Idalos argued that these genera, even those that exist in the mind, have some kind of being. They're not just empty concepts. He used a distinction from Aristotle between things being incorporeal per se and incorporeal per accidents. How did he apply this distinction to his understanding of universals?
Idalos argued that genera are incorporeal per accidens because they exist within the human soul, but they're also corporeal by participation because they're present in individual physical beings. He also used the distinction between things that subsist, hypostata, and things that only exist in thought, anhypostata. He said that only things that subsist truly have being.
So according to Idalos, the protenpolon genera are subsistent entities, while the ontopoloa and epitopoloa are beings that subsist in something else. They're still real, but in a different way than individual substances.
This subtle position, as the text concludes, suggests that labels like conceptualist or moderate realist are probably more accurate than just calling Idalos a nominalist or a realist. And by extension, those terms are probably more accurate for the Byzantine approach to this complex metaphysical problem as a whole.
This deep dive has been so enlightening. We've explored this time period of amazing intellectual activity that bridged the gap between classical antiquity and later developments in philosophy. I hope this has been valuable for you, our philosophy friend.
Me too. We've seen how Byzantine thinkers really dug into, adapted, and critiqued ancient Greek philosophy, often while considering their theological beliefs. That led to some really unique interpretations and contributions, especially in areas like the immortality of the soul and the problem of universals.
We've seen surprising connections to the past and fascinating shifts in thinking, from their continuous engagement with Homer to the heated debates about using philosophy and theology and the subtle ways they tackled the enduring ideas of Plato and Aristotle.
I hope this exploration has given you, as someone who loved philosophy, a structured but engaging overview with details and insights into the key elements and debates within Byzantine philosophy. Maybe it's even sparked some new ideas for your own philosophical reflections.
Remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of Byzantine philosophy to explore, from what specific thinkers contributed to the intricacies of their theological and philosophical disagreements.
So, as you continue your own journey in philosophy, think about this. The Byzantines tried really hard to reconcile the wisdom of ancient philosophy with Christian theology. How would you analyze similar attempts to combine different ways of thinking in today's intellectual world? Or, thinking about how much the Byzantines focused on commentary and reinterpretation, what do you think the role of interpretation is in how philosophical ideas evolve and stay relevant? We encourage you to check out the primary and secondary sources mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry and keep exploring this crucial period in the history of philosophy.